Theoretical basis of Kundalini Yoga. A letter. When you say that Kundalini Shakti is the primordial Shakti at rest, I am led to think of an analogy, and it may be more than an analogy, in modern science. Cosmic energy in its physical aspect may be considered either as static or as dynamic, the former being a condition of equilibrium, the latter a condition of motion or change of relative position. Thus, a material thing apparently at rest, there being no absolute rest except in pure consciousness or chit, should be regarded as energy or Shakti equilibrated, the various elements of it holding one another in check, or, as the mathematicians would say, the algebraic sum of the forces being zero. Of course, in any given case, the equilibrium is relative rather than absolute. The important thing to note is this polarization of Shakti into two forms, static and dynamic. In the tissues of a living body, again, the operative energy, whatever the nature of that may be, whether we believe in a special vital force or not, polarizes itself into two similar forms, anabolic and catabolic, one tending to change and the other to conserve the tissues, the actual condition of the tissues being simply the resultant of these two coexistent or concurrent activities. In the mind or experience also, this polarization or polarity is patent to reflection. In my own writings, I have constantly urged this polarity between pure chit and the stress which is involved in it. There is a stress or Shakti developing the mind through an infinity of forms and changes, but all these forms and changes are known as involved in the pure and unbounded ether of awareness, that is, Chidakasha. This analysis therefore exhibits the primordial Shakti in the same two polar forms as before, static and dynamic, and here the polarity is most fundamental and approaches absoluteness. Lastly, let us consider for one moment the atom of modern science. The chemical atom has ceased to be an atom, indivisible unit of matter. We have instead the electron theory. According to this, the so-called atom is a miniature universe, very much like our own solar system. At the center of this atomic system, we have a charge of positive electricity, round which a cloud of negative charges, called electrons, is supposed to revolve, just as myriads of planets and smaller bodies revolve around the sun. The positive and negative charges hold each other in check, so the atom is a condition of equilibrated energy, and does not therefore ordinarily break up, though it may possibly break up and set free its equilibrated store of energy, as probably it does in the emanations of the radium. What do we notice here? The same polarity of Shakti into a static and dynamic partner, the positive charge at rest at the center and the negative charges in motion round the center. A most suggestive analogy or illustration, perhaps, of the cosmic facts. The illustration may be carried into other domains of science and philosophy, but I may as well forbear going into details. For the present, we may, I think, draw this important conclusion. Shakti, as manifesting itself in the universe, divides itself into two polar aspects, static and dynamic, which implies that you cannot have it in a dynamic form without at the same time having it in a corresponding static form, much like the poles of a magnet. In any given sphere of activity or force, we must have, according to this cosmic principle, a static background, Shakti at rest or coiled, as the Tantras say. Before I proceed, let me point out what I conceive to be the fundamental significance of our Tantric and Puranic Kali. This figure or murti is both real and symbolic, as indeed every murti is in the so-called Hindu mythology. Now the Divine Mother Kali is the symbol of the cosmic truth just explained. Sada Shiva, on whose breast she dances, nude and dark, is the static background of pure Chit, white and inert, because pure Chit is in itself Swaprakasha, meaning self-manifest, and Niskriya, meaning actionless. At the same time, apart from and beyond consciousness, there can be nothing, no power or Shakti. Hence the Divine Mother stands on the bosom of the Divine Father. The Mother herself is all activity and Gunnamayi, meaning in her aspect as Prakriti, composed of the gunas. Her nakedness means that, though she encompasses all, there is nothing to encompass herself. Her darkness means that she is inscrutable, beyond the reach of thought and speech. Of course, there is no partition of reality into two. There lies the imperfection of the Sankhya doctrine of Purusha and Prakriti, which otherwise all right, but merely polarization in our experience of an indivisible fact, which is the primordial Shakti itself. Thus, Chit is also Shakti. Shiva is Shakti and Shakti is Shiva, as the Tantras say. It is Gunastraya, meaning support of gunas, as well as Gunamaya, meaning whose substance is gunas. Nirguna, meaning attributeless, as well as Saguna, meaning with attribute, as said in the well-known passage of the Chandi. Your suggestive hint makes the nature of the Kundalini Shakti rather clear to me. You are quite right, perhaps, in saying that the cosmic Shakti is the Samashti, or collectivity, in relation to which the Kundalini in the bodies is only the Vyasti, or individual. It is an illustration, a reproduction on a miniature scale, a microcosmic plan of the whole. The law or principle of the whole, that of macrocosmic Shakti, should therefore be found in the Kundalini. That law we have seen to be the law of polarization into static dynamic or potential kinetic aspects. In the living body, therefore, there must be such polarization. Now, the Kundalini coiled 3 times and a half at the Muladhara is the indispensable and unfailing static background of the dynamic Shakti operative in the whole body, carrying on processes and working out changes. The body therefore may be compared to a magnet with 2 poles. The Muladhara is the static pole in relation to the rest of the body, which is dynamic. The working the body necessarily presupposes and finds such a static support, hence perhaps the name Muladhara, the fundamental support. In one sense, the static Shakti at the Muladhara is necessarily coexistent with the creating and evolving Shakti of the body, because the dynamic aspect or pole can never be without its static counterpart. In another sense, It is the Shakti left over after the Prithvi, the last of the Bhutas, has been created, a magazine of power to be drawn upon and utilized for further activity, if there should arise any need for such. Taking the two senses together, yours as well as mine, Shakti at the Muladhara is both coexistent with every act of creation or manifestation, and is the residual effect of such act, both cause and effect, in fact. An idea which, deeply looked into, shows no real contradiction. There is, in fact, what the physicists will describe as a cycle or circuit in action. Let us take the impregnated ovum, the earliest embryological state of the living body. In it, the Kundalini Shakti is already presented in its two polar aspects. The ovum, which the mother element represents, one pole, possibly the static, and the spermatozoon, which is the father element, represents the other, possibly the dynamic. From their fusion proceed the processes which the biologist calls differentiation and integration. But in all this process of creation, the cycle can be fairly easily traced. Shakti flows out of the germinal cell, that is, the fertilized ovum, seizes upon foreign matter and assimilates it, and thereby grows in bulk, divides and subdivides itself, and then again coordinates all its divided parts into one organic whole. Now in all this we have the cycle. Seizing upon foreign matter is an outwardly directed activity. Assimilation is an inwardly directed activity or return current. Cell division and multiplication is an outwardly directed operation. Coordination is inwardly directed, and so on. The force in the germ cell is overflowing, but also continuously it is flowing back into itself. The two operations presupposing and sustaining each other, as in every circuit. The given stock of force in the germ cell, which is static so long as the fusion of the male and female elements does not take place in the womb, is the necessary starting point of all creative activity. It is the primordial cause, therefore in relation to the body, primordial as well as constantly given unceasing. On the other hand, the reaction of every creative action, the return current or flowing back of every unfolding overflow, constantly renews this starting force, changes it without changing its general condition of relative equilibrium. The force in the germ cell may therefore be also regarded as a perpetual effect, something left over and set against the working forces of the body. Many apparently inconsistent ideas enter into this conception, and they have to be reconciled. 1. We start with a force in the germ cell, which is statical at first. Let this be Kundalini coiled. 2. Then there is creative impulse arising out of it. This is motion out of rest. By this, the Kundalini becomes partly static and partly dynamic, or ejects, so to say, a dynamic pole out of it in order to evolve the body, but remaining a static pole or background itself all along. In no part of the process has the Kundalini really uncoiled itself altogether, or even curtailed its 3 coils and a half. Without this, Muladhara Shakti remaining intact, no evolution could be possible at all. It is the hinge upon which everything else turns. 3. Each creative act again reacts on the Muladhara Shakti, so that such reaction, without disturbing the relative rest of the coiled Shakti, changes its volume or intensity, but does not curtail or add to the number of coils. For instance, every natural act of respiration reacts on the coiled Shakti at the Muladhara, but it does not commonly make much difference. But pranayama powerfully reacts on it, so much so that it awakes the dormant power and sends it piercing through the centers. Now the common description of the Kundalini uncoils herself, then and goes up the Shushumna, leaving the Muladhara, should I think be admitted with caution. The static background can never be absolutely dispensed with. As you yourself have rightly observed, Shakti can never be depleted, but this is how to look at it. Precisely, the Kundali, when powerfully worked upon by yoga, sends forth an emanation or ejection in the likeness of her own self, like an ethereal double of the Theosophists and Spiritualists, which pierces through the various centers until it becomes blended, as you point out, with the Maha Kundali of Shiva at the highest or seventh center. Thus, while this ethereal double or self-ejection of the coiled power at the Muladhara ascends the Shushumna, the coiled power itself does not and need not stir from its place. It is like a spark given from an oversaturated electromagnetic machine, or rather, it is like the emanations of radium, which do not sensibly detract from the energy contained in it. This last, perhaps, is the closest physical parallel of the case that we are trying to understand. As a well-known passage in the Upanishad has it, the whole, or Purna, is subtracted from the whole, and yet the whole remains. I think our present case comes very near to this. The Kundalini at the Muladhara is the whole primordial Shakti in monad or germ latency. That is why it is coiled. The Kundalini that mounts up the Nadi is also the whole Shakti in a specially dynamic form, an eject likeness of the eternal serpent. The result of the last fusion in the Sahasrara is also the whole, or Purna. This is how I look at it. In this conception, the permanent static background is not really depleted, much less is it dispensed with. When again I say that the volume or intensity of the coiled power can be affected, I do not mean to throw up the principle of conservation of energy in relation to the Kundalini, which is the embodiment of all energy. It is merely the conversion of static or potential energy into dynamic or kinetic energy in part, the sum remaining constant. As we have to deal with infinities here, the exact physical rendering of this principle is not to be expected. The yogi, therefore, simply awakens and never creates Shakti. By the way, the germ cell which evolves the body does not, according to modern biology, cease to be a germ cell in any stage of the complicated process. The original germ cell splits up into two. One half gradually develops itself into the body of a plant or animal. This is the somatic cell. The other half remains encased within the body, practically unchanged, and is transmitted in the process of reproduction to the offspring, that is, the germ plasm. Now this germ plasm is unbroken through the whole line of propagation. This is Wiseman's doctrine of continuity of the germ plasm, which has been widely accepted, though it is but a hypothesis. Shakti being either static or dynamic, every dynamic form necessarily presupposes a static background. A purely dynamic activity, which is motion in its physical aspect, is impossible without a static support or ground, that is, adhara. Hence the philosophical doctrine of absolute motion or change, as taught by old Heraclitus and the Buddhists, and by modern Bergson, is wrong. It is based neither upon correct logic nor upon clear intuition. The constitution of an atom reveals the static dynamic polarization of Shakti. Other and more complex forms of existence also do the same. In the living body, this necessary static background is Muladhara, where Shakti is Kundalini coiled. All the functional activity of the body, starting from the development of the germ cell, is correlated to and sustained by the Shakti concentrated at the Muladhara. Cosmic creation, too, ending with the evolution of Prithvi Tattva, also presupposes a cosmic static background of Parmeshwara or Parmeshvari, that is, the Supreme Lord in the male and female aspect. In the earliest stage of creation, when the world arises in divine consciousness, it requires as the principle or pole of Tat, meaning that, the correlate principle or pole of Aham, meaning I. In the development of the former, the latter serves as the static background. In our own experiences, too, our perception or consciousness of self is the sustaining background, a string, so to say, which holds together all the loose beads of our elements of feeling. The sustaining ground, or adhara, as the seat of static force, therefore, is found, in one form or another, in every phase and state of creative evolution. The absolute or ultimate form is, of course, Chit Shakti, meaning consciousness as power. It itself, the unfailing light of awareness about which our Gayatri Mantra says, which sustains and impels all the activities of Buddhi. This fact is symbolized by the Kali Murti. It says, not mere symbol, however. My remarks about the rising or awakening of the serpent power at the Muladhara have been perhaps almost of the nature of a paradox. The coiled power, though awakened, uncoiled and rising, never really stirs from its place. Only a sort of ethereal double or eject is unloosened and sent up through the system of centers. Now, in plain language, this ethereal double or eject means the dynamic equivalent of the static power concentrated at the mula or root. Whenever by pranayama of bija mantra or any other suitable means the Muladhara becomes like an electromagnetic machine, oversaturated, a dynamic equivalent or operative equivalent of the static power is set up, possibly by a law similar to nature's law of induction, by which the static power itself is not depleted or rendered other than static. Though the Kundali Shakti at the Mula is infinite and exhaustless, yet the capacity of a given finite organism to contain it in a static form is limited, and therefore there may be oversaturation. It is not that static energy at the Mula wholly passes over into a dynamic form, the coiled Kundalini leaving the Mula, thus making it a void. That cannot be, and were it so, all dynamic operation in the body would cease, directly for want of a background. The coiled power remains coiled or static, and yet something apparently passes out of the Mula, the dynamic equivalent. This paradox can perhaps be explained in two ways. One explanation was suggested in my main letter. The potential Kundalini Shakti becomes partly converted into kinetic Shakti, and yet, since Shakti, even as given in the Mula center, is an infinitude, it is not depleted. The potential store always remains unexhausted. I referred to a passage in the Upanishad about Purna. In this case, the dynamic equivalent is a partial conversion of one mode of energy into another. In Laya Yoga, here described, it is ordinarily so. When, however, the infinite potential becomes an infinite kinetic, when, that is to say, the coiled power at the Mula becomes absolutely uncoiled, we have necessarily the dissolution of the three bodies, Sthula, Linga, and Karana, gross, subtle, causal, and so on, and consequently Videha Mukti, meaning bodiless liberation, because the static background in relation to a particular form of existence has now wholly given way, according to our hypothesis. But Maha Kundalini remains. Hence individual mukti, or liberation, need not mean dissolution of samsara, meaning transmigrating worlds itself. Commonly, however, as the Tantra says, pitva, pitva, puna pitva. Having drunk, having drunk, having again drunk. A passage in the Kulnarva Tantra signifying not actually drinking, but repeating raising of Kundalini. The second explanation is suggested by the law of induction. Take an electromagnetic machine. If a suitable substance be placed near it, it will induce in it an equivalent and opposite kind of electromagnetism, without losing its own stock of energy. In conduction, energy flows over into another thing, so that the source loses and the other thing gains what it has lost, and its gain is similar in kind to the loss. Not so in induction. There the source does not lose, and the induced energy is equivalent and opposite in kind to the inducing energy. Thus a positive charge will induce an equivalent negative charge in the neighboring object. Now shall we suppose that the Muladhara, when it becomes oversaturated, induces in the neighboring center, let's say the Swadhisthana, a dynamic or not static equivalent? Is this what the rise of the serpent power really means? The explanation, I am tempted to think, is not perhaps altogether fantastic. Sir John Woodroffe notes, in reply to this highly interesting and illustrative account of my friend, I wrote suggesting some difficulties in the way of the acceptance of his statement that Kundalini Shakti did not in fact herself uncoil and ascend, but projected upwards an emanation in the likeness of her own self. The difficulty I felt was this. In the first place, the yoga books, to which full credence must be given in this matter, unequivocally affirm that Kundalini herself does in fact ascend. This is borne out by some inquiries made of a Tantric Pandit, very familiar with this Shastra, after the receipt of the letter quoted. As the body of the yogi still lives, though in an inert, corpse-like condition, when consciousness of it is lost, I asked him how the body was sustained when Kundalini left her central abode. His answer was that it was maintained by the nectar which flows from the union of Shiva and Shakti in the Sahasrara. This nectar is an ejection of power generated by their union. If Kundalini does not ascend, but a mere emanative spark of her, how is it that the body becomes cold and corpse-like? Would this follow if the power still remained at its center, and merely sent forth a dynamic equivalent of itself? There were further difficulties in the theory put forward by my friend, though it may be that there are also difficulties in the acceptance of the statement that the Muladhara is entirely depleted of the great power. I suggested that Kundalini was the static center of the whole body, as a complete conscious organism, and that each of the parts of the body and their constituent cells must have their own static centers, which would uphold such parts and cells, and that the life of the body as a collection of material particles was sustained by the nectar which flowed from Kundalini Shakti when in union with Shiva in the Sahasrara. In reply, Professor P. Mukhopadhyaya dealt with the matter as follows. According to my presentation of the case, a dynamic equivalent or operative double is certainly sent forth from the Muladharas, but this basic center or seat is not depleted or rendered void of static energy in consequence of that operation. The Mula or root, as the seat of static or coiled power, can never be dispensed with. It is the sine qua non of all functions of the triple body, that is gross, subtle, and causal. It is, so to say, the buffer or base against which any activity of the jiva must react or recoil, like a naval or any other kind of heavy gun against its base or emplacement. Thus, while the dynamic or uncoiled Shakti ascends the axis, the static or coiled Shakti remains its place at the Mula, and remains at the very possibility of the dynamic upheaval. The ascending power is simply the dynamic counterpart of the static ground. To say that Kundalini leaves its place and ascends is only to say that it ceases to be Kundali and becomes dynamic. The ascending power is therefore uncoiled or non-Kundalini power. It is the dynamic expression of the Kundalini power. So far all can agree. But the question is the Mula depleted or deprived of all power, especially coiled power, when the dynamical expression leaves it and ascends the axis? Is the dynamic expression wholly at the expense of the static ground? Should the latter cease in order that the former may commence? Here, I think, I must answer in the negative. It is a case of power leaving as well as remaining, leaving as dynamic and remaining as static. It is the case of the Kundalini being uncoiled in one aspect or pole and remaining still coiled in another aspect or pole. A paradox, perhaps, but like most paradoxes, it is likely to be true. Is scriptural authority, which, by the by, I hold in utmost reverence, really challenged by this interpretation? The nature of the dynamic equivalent and its relation to the static background have been indicated in the previous two communications, and I need not dilute them. I have claimed throughout that the Muladhara as the seat of static, that is, coiled power, can never be rendered a vacuum in relation to such power, except in the circumstances of Videha Mukti, that is, bodiless liberation, when the triple body, gross, subtle, and causal, must dissolve. I think also that the point of view which you have taken can be reconciled with this interpretation of the matter. The Kundalini Shakti is the static aspect of the life of the whole organized body, as you rightly say. The relation between the lives of the individual cells and that of the whole organism is not clearly understood in science. Is the common life a merely mechanical resultant of the lives of the individual cells? Or are the lives of the individual cells only detailed manifestations of the common life? In other words, is the common life cause and the cell lives effects, or vice versa? Science is not yet settled on this point. As a subscriber to the Shaktivada, that is, doctrine of Shakti, I am inclined, however, to give primacy to the common life. In the germ cell itself, the common life is given in a substance, and the whole development of the Jiva Deha, meaning Jiva body, is only the detailed carrying out in particulars of what has already been given in substance, according to the principle of adrishta, meaning karma. Nevertheless, I am quite willing to concede to the individual cell lives of semi-independence. Semi, because they require to be sustained to a considerable degree by the life of the whole. Benefit or injury to the life of the whole reacts on the condition of the cells. The death of the whole life is followed by the death of the cells, and so on. Now in every cell there is, of course, static dynamic polarity in the whole organism. Also there is such polarity or correlation. In the whole organism, the static pole, or correlate, is the coiled power at the Muladhara, and the dynamic correlate is the operative power, that is, the five pranas: prana, apana, samana, udana, and vyana, which actually carries out the various functions of the body. Ordinarily, therefore, this dynamic power is distributed over the whole body, vitalizing not merely the larger tissues, but the microscopic cells. Now, the devitalization, as you say, of the body in Kundalini Yoga or Sat Chakra Bheda is due, I venture to think, not to the depletion or privation of the static power at the Muladhara, but to the concentration or convergence of the dynamic power ordinarily diffused over the whole body, so that the dynamic equivalent, which is set up as the static background or Kundalini Shakti, is only the diffused fivefold prana gathered home, withdrawn from the other tissues of the body, and concentrated in a line along the axis. Thus, ordinarily, the dynamic equivalent is the prana diffused over all the tissues. In yoga, it is converged along the axis, the static equivalent, or Kundalini Shakti, enduring in both cases. Thus, also the polarity or correlation is maintained. In the former case, between Shakti at Muladhara and the diffused prana. In the latter case, between Shakti at Mula and the converged prana along the axis. This will perhaps adequately explain coldness, increased inertia, insensibility, and so on, of the rest of the body in Kundalini Yoga of which you write. Commonly in yoga, this withdrawal and convergence of prana is incomplete. The residual prana, together with the lives of the cells, keeps the body alive, though inert or corpse-like. In the case of complete withdrawal and focusing, the cells will die and the body disintegrate. On the other hand, if the coil power were simply and wholly uncoiled, that is, dynamized in Kundalini Yoga, then there should be an excess rather than a defect of vitality all over the body. Nothing would be subtracted from the already available dynamic energy of the body, but something would be added to it on account of the static power at the mula being rendered kinetic and going up the axis and influencing the neighboring tissues. Hence, I should venture to conclude that the static power at the base of the axis, without itself being depleted or rendered other than static, induces or produces a dynamic equivalent, which is the diffused prana of the body, gathered and converged along the axis. The states in the process may thus be summarily indicated. 1. To begin with, there is coiled power at the base of the axis, and its necessary correlate, the dynamic prana, diffused all over the body in the 5 forms. 2. In Kundalini Yoga, some part of the already available dynamic prana is made to act at the base of the axis in a suitable manner, by which means the base, or particularly the 4-petaled Padma, meaning lotus, which represents this center, becomes oversaturated and reacts on the whole diffused dynamic power, or prana, of the body, by withdrawing it from the tissues and converging it along the line of the axis. In this way, the diffused dynamic equivalent becomes the converged dynamic equivalent along the axis. This is what the rising of the serpent perhaps means. In thus reacting, the coiled power has not lost its general equilibrium or static condition. The modus operandi of this reaction is difficult to indicate, but it is probably, as suggested in my previous communications, either a partial conversion of the infinite coiled power into the sort of influence that can thus gather and be diffused prana, and converge in its own resultant line along the axis, or an inductive action analogous to electromagnetic action by which the pranas are collected and converged. In this latter case, there is no need for conversion of the static energy. We shall have perhaps to choose between, or rather coordinate, these 2 explanations in understanding the modus operandi. In mathematical language, the diffused prana is a scalar quantity, that is, having magnitude but no direction, while the converged prana is a vector quantity, that is, having both magnitude and definite direction. Suppose lastly we are witnessing with a divya chakshu, meaning inner eye, the progress of Kundalini Yoga. There, something like condensed lightning is rising from the Muladhara and gathering momentum in going from chakra to chakra, till the consummation is reached at the Parama Shivasthana, meaning abode of the Supreme Shiva. But look back and behold the Kula Kundalini is also there at the Mula, coiled 3 times and a half around the Swayambhu Linga. She has left, and yet remained or stayed, and is again coming back to herself. Is not this vision supported by scriptural authority and the experience of the yogi? Sir John Woodroffe concludes, putting aside detail, the main principle appears to be that, when wakened, Kundalini Shakti either herself, or, as my friend suggests, in her eject, ceases to be static power which sustains the world consciousness, the content of which is held only so long as she sleeps, and when once set in movement, is drawn to that other static center in the 1,000-petaled lotus of the Sahasrara, which is herself in union with the Shiva consciousness, or the consciousness of ecstasy beyond the world of forms. When Kundalini sleeps, man is awake to this world. When she wakes, he sleeps, that is, loses all consciousness of the world and enters his causal body. In yoga, he passes beyond to formless consciousness. I have only to add, without further discussion of the point, that practitioners of this yoga claim that it is higher than any other, and that the samadhi, meaning ecstasy, attained thereby is more perfect. The reason which they allege this is, in dhyana yoga, ecstasy takes place through detachment from the world and mental concentration, leading to vacuity of mental operation, or the uprising of pure consciousness, unhindered by the limitations of the mind. The degree to which this unveiling of consciousness is effected depends upon the meditative powers of the sadhaka and the extent of his detachment of the world. On the other hand, Kundalini, who is all Shakti, and who is therefore Jnana Shakti itself, produces, when awakened by the yogi, full jnana for him. Secondly, in the samadhi of dhyana yoga, there is no rousing and union of Kundalini Shakti with the accompanying bliss and acquisition of special powers or siddhis. Further, in Kundalini Yoga, it is not merely a samadhi through meditation, but through the central power of the jiva, a power which carries with it the forces of both body and mind. The union in that sense is claimed to be more complete than that enacted through mental methods only. Though in both cases bodily consciousness is lost, in Kundalini Yoga, not only the mind, but the body, in so far as it is represented by its central power, is actually united with Shiva. This union produces an enjoyment which the Dhyana Yoga does not possess. Whilst both the Divya Yogi and the Vira Sadhaka have enjoyment, or bhukti, That of the former is infinitely more intense, being an experience of bliss itself. The enjoyment of the Vira Sadhaka is but a reflection of it on the physical plane, a welling up of the true bliss through the deadening covers and trammels of matter. Again, whilst it is said that both have liberation, this word is used in Vira Sadhana in a figurative sense only, indicating a bliss which is the nearest approach on the physical plane to that of mukti, and a bhava or feeling of momentary union of Shiva and Shakti, which ripens in the higher yoga sadhana into the literal liberation of the yogi. He, in its fullest and literal sense, has both enjoyment and liberation. Hence it is claimed to be the emperor of all yogas. However this may be, I leave at this point the subject with the hope that others will continue the inquiry I have here initiated. It and other matters in the Tantra Shastra seem to me, whatever be their inherent value, worthy of an investigation, which they have not yet received. This concludes Sadhana for self-realization.